Thank you all for joining us tonight for the book launch for Refined Material. I'm so excited to see all of you here. I'm Nicole Kack, the editorial program manager here at ISLAA. You're very welcome in our new headquarters, which will actually be opening this Saturday, October 28th from 12 to 6 p.m. So I encourage you to return if you are in the city. So thank you all for joining us for this book launch for Refined Material. For those of you who are coming to ISLAA for the first time, a quick note of introduction. Founded in 2011, ISLAA supports the study and visibility of Latin American art. ISLAA recognizes Latin American artists and cultural movements as integral to the trajectory of 20th and 21st century art. We seek to expand these narratives by creating opportunities for researchers, curators, and the public through grants, exhibitions, publications, and our art and archival collections. ISLAA's partnerships with educational and art institutions include New York University, Columbia University, CCS Bard, the New Museum, Dia Art Foundation, and to the focus of this event tonight, the University of California Press. With ISLAA's support, Refined Material was published this August by University of California Press as part of the Studies on Latin American and Latinx Art series, which is edited by the inimitable Alexander Alberro, who's here tonight and will be introducing the series in a moment. Before doing so, I just want to express my thanks to colleagues in the room, including Lucy Hunter, Blanca Serrano in the back, as well as Nolan Kelly, who greeted you all at the door. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Alberro to introduce the series. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Nicole. I'm happy to be here once again. To get the evening started, let me quickly introduce the two speakers. What we will do this evening is each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes each. Is that good? And then a dialogue.
20 minutes?
What did you, is that, that's too long?
Well, it's okay. I can do it. But, listen, let me tell you something. 10 is better. But it's okay. I do 20.
10 is good. But Sean, you've prepared something for 20 minutes, so I don't feel that you have to
I never
curtail.
prepare anything. Huh?
That's even better.
I improvise all my life.
That's good. So we're going to improvise for a while as the evening begins, and then once the improvisation starts to either get heated or get cool, we'll take it to questions from the audience. Anyway, let me introduce the two presenters today, Sean Nesselrode Moncada and Rolando Peña. Sean is a historian of Latin American and Latinx art and architecture and visual culture who currently teaches at the Rhode Island School of Design. His research focuses on visual and material modernisms, their uneven implementation across the hemisphere, and their contested social and ecological dimensions. He's published on a variety of subjects, including the politics of abstraction in South America, the rise and fall of leftist counterculture in 1960s Venezuela, and the visual legacies of settler colonialism in contemporary art. His writings and reviews have been featured in a broad array of journals and periodicals, and this evening we will be addressing more specifically the book that he has just published in the series that I edit with Jennifer Gonzalez for the University of California Press. Rolando Peña is a conceptual artist whose work spans performance, happenings, installation, printmaking, film, and video. Since the 1980s, his practice is centered on crude oil, a symbol through which he's critiqued consumer society and oil exploitation and extraction. He represented Venezuela at the London Biennial in 2002 and at the Venice Biennale in 1997. Exhibitions of his work have been featured at a large number of galleries and museums, and he's received numerous prestigious accolades, including the Armando Reveron Award in 2012, Creative Artist Public Service Program Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship in 2009, and many more. So please help me in welcoming our two speakers today. We'll start with Sean.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for that warm introduction. And I have a number of thank yous that I must begin. Thank you to all of you for being here tonight on an unexpectedly warm Wednesday in October. Thank you to Alexander for all of your work editing the series. I'm very proud to be part of the series on the studies on Latin American and Latinx art. Thank you to Ariel Isaacs for a decade of steadfast support for my research. Thank you to Blanca Serrano for, again, much friendship and support. Thank you to Nicole Kak for helping organize this event. Thank you to Rolando and Carla for both being here today and flying up. And my biggest thanks are for my husband, Ty, who is here in the audience today and an eternal source of support. And so, absolutely, yes. So it's a little bit surreal to be here at my book launch because it represents about a decade of work. The book, Refined Material, is the product or the afterlife, let's say, of my doctoral dissertation that I completed at the Institute of Fine Arts. And I want to just kind of begin by thinking about the cover design because I had a really interesting set of conversations with the graphic design team at University of California Press about how to sum up what this book is about in an image in a way that was still kind of conforming to the graphic design identity of the series on studies on Latin American and Latinx art. And I was very, I'll confess, I was adamant that I didn't want the cover to have any pictures of oil derricks or oil towers or anything.
What a shame.
I know.
What a shame. Listen, oh
Yeah.
my God.
That's the second book, maybe. But
Next one. Don't worry about it.
no, but I was very interested in the lingua franca of Venezuelan modernity and why Soto, of all individuals, amongst a whole kind of pantheon of other abstract and kinetic artists, became the kind of faces of mid-century Venezuelan modernity. What was it about this kind of art? It was the kinetic elephant in the room. And that was the genesis, I think, of the project way back when I was a grad student at the IFA. And I was thinking, in particular about this work. Not only is it just a stunning work of art, this Vibración Azul Cobalto, but I wanted to a certain extent, to catch the reader a little bit off guard, because there's nothing in this work that immediately announces itself as either, in allegiance to, or maybe better stated, in incorporation with a broader kind of petroculture or oil culture in Venezuela. And of course, Soto, I think, would absolutely resist any kind of designation. And so I kind of wanted to lean into that discomfort to a certain extent. And his, not this particular vibration, but Soto's kind of brand of vibration and vibraciones play a role in kind of the development of this book and its argument in thinking about the broader ideology of petroculture that might not be immediately visible in terms of a kind of iconography. The back cover, however, I decided we could have some oil derricks. And it's a detail of this, of the cover image for the script for a documentary called Pozo Muerto that was produced within the same decade as the Soto Vibración. And the documentary dates to 1967 and it's an incendiary polemic, which is now available on YouTube thanks to 2023 technology. That was produced and released under the banner of the dissident collective El Techo de la Ballena, or the Roof of the Whale, a very fascinating interdisciplinary and anarchic group that was active between 1961 and 1969. And so this kind of duo, I'm quite jazzed about, to have as the front and back cover of the book, because there's an interesting sort of conceptual link between them. But I was thinking about how these two manifestations of, lo moderno in Venezuela manifest. How do they work with each other, against each other, and what do they say about the very idea of the modern in a country that that experienced, and to this day experiences, such convulsions politically, economically, socially, ecologically, to that matter. And so I was thinking about oil in particular, not as just a kind of tangible link in terms of modernity and petroculture through financial kind of patronage, through institutional affiliations, through the sponsorship of scholarships, et cetera, which is a very material and very real link between the oil industry and the development of a kind of Venezuelan modernism. But I was more interested, or maybe more deeply interested, in what the conceptual parameters of extraction and refinement actually are. What does it mean to look at nature, to look at the world, to look at society, and refine it, to refine oneself, to refine a country into an ostensibly more exalted or more developed kind of version of itself. And what is the genesis of that in the extractivist impulse? And of course, this doesn't date to 1922 with Barroso número dos and the kind of originary, quote unquote, blowout in Venezuela, but is part of a much, 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 much longer kind of colonial history of extractivism and extraction in the Americas. That's getting a little bit ahead, but I want to connect this specifically to Rolando because it's fitting that that the book launch is not the period of the book, but it is a celebration, I think, of the work, and I have to credit Rolando for his work and his kind of presence and his dynamism for being the origin point of the book, and I can trace it, weirdly enough, to seeing one particular work of art a decade ago in 2013 at the at El Museo del Barrio as part of the Caribbean Art of the Crossroads of the World exhibition, which I saw when I was a graduate student. And there was one gallery amongst many that was dedicated specifically to petroleum extraction in Venezuela. And amongst other works by Alessandro Yazbek, Rainey Bennett, and others, there was very unmistakably this work meant a devotional object, which Rolando first created in 1982, and it was part of this exhibition, as a kind of quasi-minimalist gilded cube, but with a twist, because if you look in kind of the eye hole, or the peephole, or however you want to call it, there is this image, or not this image, but this actual kind of very tiny gilded oil barrel, which is kind of the icon of Rolando's work, repeated ad infinitum in a kind of mirrored field. And I don't know what it was, but I saw this work in the gallery, and suddenly all of my kind of very, very graduate school kind of term papers on Soto or El Techo, suddenly something shifted into place. And I think that's the kind of strangeness of being attuned to petroculture in particular, at least the way that I have experienced it, because it's a kind of phenomenon where once you see it and once you start seeing oil, it kind of seeps into a little bit of everything. And I joke quite often with friends and family and students that I have a very oily brain, just by virtue of my own biography. I grew up in Houston, Texas. My family's from Venezuela, so oil is always in the picture. But it was this originary kind of spark that petroculture, or the oil structure, as the anthropologist Rodolfo Quintero put it, is that once you see it, you can't really unsee it or unlearn it. And that, I think, is what I'm hoping to do with this particular book, is to not necessarily rewrite the story of Venezuelan modernity, because I wouldn't presume to do such a thing, but maybe to take a slightly different angle, and in that respect, shed light on some of the the ideological scaffolding that makes it possible, and then by dint, not limited to Venezuela, but maybe make us think about the modern and what it was to be modern in slightly different terms. And so I begin the book with this particular work by Alejandro Otero called Mástil Reflejante, or Reflecting Mast, from 1954. And it's one of the few instances that we have, or that I've been able to identify, where there is that tangible link between Venezuelan modernist abstraction and literal petroculture, in this case a gas station in Las Mercedes. And here we see it, currently the gas station is managed by PDVSA, but at the time it was managed by Shell when it was constructed by Otero, and this immediately predates his celebrated Coloritmos. So it's a kind of hinge moment for the artist, and I would say for the country, because we have the very unusual conflation of a totem to abstract modernity in a kind of grid-like formation with the incised aluminum. But what is it doing in a gas station of all places? Why here and why then? And so this kind of attuned me to the phenomena of petroculture, and just to make sure that we're all on the same page, petroculture is the term derives in part from the Petrocultures Research Group out of the University of Alberta, and it comprises the social imaginaries brought into being by the energies of fossil fuels. And they go on to develop it further to say it derives from the material and immaterial infrastructures and the superstructures that shape our daily lived realities, govern our choices and mobilities within existing social, economic, and political networks. And so the gas station is kind of a harbinger of a modern that is, very rapidly developing, and this is during a moment of intense developmentalism, urbanization that's happening in Caracas under the aegis of Perez Jimenez, who was the kind of the president and, well, de facto president, but in reality dictator in Venezuela during this period, devoted to the rational transformation of the physical environment. And if there's ever an extractive, petrocultural phrase, that's the one. To kind of, in the years of the bulldozer, as they're sometimes called, to renovate the entire country. And in this case, we have abstraction and oil directly in conflict or in contact maybe with one another, but it also reminds me of a similar work taken nearly 70 years later by Sebastián Mejía from his Quasi-Oasis series. And here, of course, we see the totem, to modernity has been swapped out for a palm tree. And it recalls Alessandro Peteo's Yazbek dyad of the grid and the palm tree. And here we have both the grid and the palm tree in Shell gas stations. And so the book is very much about how the palm tree gets refined into the grid, but also how the process of refining doesn't really erase the palm tree and all it represents, whether it be nature or ecology or the natural body, as Fernando Coronilla would say, but rather how it becomes transmuted and transformed into a different version of itself, which is essentially an analog for what the country went through in the 20th century, and much of the world, in the so-called global South, in terms of development, quote unquote, and I say that with lots and lots of scare quotes. This is just an example of kind of the logic of petroculture at work. This Recursos y Productos de América Latina, which was from Latin American trade and economics. And it is a map of Latin America, quote unquote, but reduced to its commodities. And of course, Venezuela is represented by oil, as well as emeralds and pearls and gold, bringing to mind, the cliche of black gold and how oil is meant to be this kind of magic gilded, crude bullet to modernity, to refine ourselves into a so-called first world model. And the engine, of this, I use a lot of oily metaphors, so I'm sorry, you have to bear with me. But the engine of all of this is really not just kind of the mechanics of extraction, but the kind of the theoretical sort of imaginary. That the natural world is not necessarily a kind of holistic, natura naturans kind of model, but rather that it is a deposit of minerals, of stuff, of things that can be extracted or harvested, and it comes, out of, in particular, one individual, Arturo Uslar-Pietri, and I see a lot of faces of recognition of this particular individual, who in 1936, published an editorial in Aurum journal saying that in response to the potential monopolization of the oil industry, of the economy by the oil industry that he was seeing happening at this moment, which led to profound labor strikes on the part of oil workers, he said that rather than becoming an immense parasite of petroleum, the country would have to sembrar el petróleo, or sow the oil. And it's a phrase that is profoundly weird the longer that we think about it, because to sow oil back into the country is a kind of agricultural metaphor. And of course, the harvest then is going to be some kind of idea of the modern. And Perez Jimenez in the 50s takes this and runs with it, and thinks, and the ideology under a kind of militarist dictatorship is that the harvest is going to be hotels and buildings and infrastructure and paving the roads and bringing a kind of what Lisa Blackmore calls a spectacular modernity into fruition that is at once a validation of extractivism and makes it and kind of perpetuates it into a self-fulfilling sort of prophecy. And so, in thinking about the argumentative thrust of the book, I didn't want it just to be the book to the argument to be simply that oil is relevant to modernity, but rather that it is specifically refinement that is the key to considering the mechanics and the forces that are at play in this structure, in this oil structure. Because refinement itself, crude is very evasive, at least in terms of our daily life. We don't really come into contact with it. But oil is everywhere, from plastic bottles to the gilded barrels of Rolando Peña, and it's refinement that is a displacement, that distances crude from our direct kind of contact and our direct familiarity. And so the kind of oil encounter, as Amitav Ghosh puts it, is never really represented directly in art or literature, except for extreme kind of circumstances. And I think Rolando has done a lot of work to attune us to the ubiquity of petroleum, not just in Venezuelan modernity and Venezuelan kind of self-imaginaries, but also a kind of global petroculture that we still very much live in and is still very much at play in the political, economic, and social forces within which we find ourselves. And so the structure of the book is divided into 5 case studies and an epilogue. And I wanted intentionally to cast a broad swath in terms of media and temporality to investigate the many facets of petroculture. And it begins with some direct, immediate links. In particular, chapter 1 is about El Farol, or the lamp, as it's translated. And El Farol is best known as a kind of laboratory for innovative graphic design in Venezuela, primarily in the 50s and the 60s, with individuals like Gerd Leufert, Nedo, and Carlos Cruz Diaz. And this is a work from 1974 that Cruz Diaz designs as a guest art director for a very, very late edition of the journal. And at first glance, we might think, what is happening here? How could Cruz Diaz be relevant to an oil journal that is the official mouthpiece of Creole Petroleum Corporation, a subsidiary of Standard Oil of New Jersey? But Cruz Diaz served as an art director for in a time being in the 1940s and 50s, and really cut his teeth in the pages of El Farol. And what I want to argue, at least in this particular instance, is that the kind of conflation of abstraction and oil is not necessarily a one-off in 1974, but it has been ground that is very, very well prepared over 30 years of fusing cultural patronage and cultural promotion of figures like Nedo and Gerd Leufert, and a progressively abstract idiom as we move into the 1970s, with the priorities of the oil industry, namely a kind of cultivation of a localized nationalism that involves kind of the oil industry in terms of patronage, in terms of standard of living, building infrastructure, providing housing to workers. And it's a very tangible link that I argue is manifest in this particular journal. And we can see here some very early, very different kind of graphic design choices and identities for the journal in its first decade of existence in 1939, in which we have a Thomas Golding landscape that on the back cover of this very same journal has been refined into a taxonomy of numbers and barrels and output. This is a landscape that has been instrumentalized, that has been worked and produced in ways that are maybe not immediately visible to us, and anyone who's looking at this was probably recognizing the kind of geographic structure and topography of El Avila in Caracas, with global production and Venezuelan production. Chapter 2 moves into actual tangible space and thinks about architecture and urban and suburban planning by looking at Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill's design for Julivana community, a housing community and a company town for Creole Petroleum Corporation, the same corporation that published El Farol, but that commissioned Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, the US firm, to design an entire neighborhood for expats, and primarily expats, but as well as Venezuelan oil workers, around a refinery. And we see here 2 refinery at the very base of this community center plan. And so I look at Julivana in particular as the apotheosis of a much longer kind of oil camp structure, which sits really interestingly between a kind of company town model, a US subdivision model, and a military encampment model. and all three coalesce through the very intensive activity of corporate, foreign corporate and architectural kind of forces and interests into refining the Paraguaná Peninsula, a supposed wasteland, even though it was inhabited by indigenous peoples for hundreds of years before then, into a supposedly productive model for the country. And that model of the oil camps extends into chapter 3, which focuses on the Hotel Humboldt, which is maybe the most iconic architectural emblem of the years of the bulldozer, of the Perecimiento of the 1950s. It was built in a record 199 days after the design by Tomás José Sanabria. And this is a postcard that kind of gestures to the very strange kind of phenomenon of building a hotel at the top of a mountain with a funicular or a teleférico that is connecting it. And in this chapter, I start to move away from the tangible and literal links between the oil industry and modernism and think about the conceptual parameters of how that is inflecting a developmentalist kind of mindset where we're not literally refining the landscape into oil or gasoline or petrodollars, but it's being refined for a tourist experience to provide access on the part of the community, or specific communities, I should say, in Caracas, and an international tourist community that Pérez Jiménez is catering to in the effort to refine Venezuela into a so-called modern nation. And this was part of a much broader kind of touristic campaign. And so, you know, petroculture assumes less financial and material terms and operates on a much more nebulous kind of dimension in this particular case. And this was this chapter is kind of the pivot point of the argument of the book, in which we move away from literal links to thinking about the broader kind of maybe invisible or less immediately visible tenets of petroculture. And then, of course, that brings us to Soto and kinetic art. For Soto, I wanted to tackle the problem of kinetic art and why I think it is kind of becomes the lingua franca of modernity. And that's not just, you know, the kind of gestures towards cosmopolitanism, towards a kind of lowercase p progressivism, you know, in terms of artistic movements towards abstraction, but rather that there's something very specific about the impulse to provide the world, or not to provide the world, but to materialize or dematerialize, in very Soto terms, matter into energy. And this is a very unusual chapter because it's the only one that takes us outside of Venezuela, because it focuses on an installation called Muro Cinético from 1961 that Soto did for the Bevog and Beveging exhibition, or Moving Movement, which is a great kind of translation, at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. And it was a site-specific mural cycle that, rather than the characteristic kind of geometric elements or bars or tangles of wire that we saw in the Vibración, sets into perceptual dematerialization elements from nature, namely tree branches, ropes, netting, fishing netting in particular. And so what Soto is doing in this particular moment is essentially revealing, not that he is necessarily thinking about oil per se, I think he would very much disagree with me in my kind of line of argument in that respect, but rather that the impulse to see nature in particular it informs us about the broader kinetic thrust of Venezuelan modernity that presumes that, you know, in a very kind of atomic era sort of sensibility, that matter and energy are not separate but rather continuous, that matter can be dematerialized into energy or refined into energy or blasted or anything. The metaphors that are used in particular for Soto by critics and by the artist himself are unnervingly reminiscent of the refining process of distilling and cracking and introducing new elements to produce a kind of, or unlock a kind of dynamis or a kind of energy. And so here I propose a kind of counter reading of kinetic art that it doesn't indict Soto, or it doesn't kind of seek to dismiss kinetic art as complicit or anything of the sort, but rather just to illustrate that petroculture is so pervasive and so omnipresent that is informing the very way that we think about art, about nature, about matter and things and humanity itself. And finally, the final chapter of the book deals with El Techo and looks at the flip side, focusing particularly on Pozo Muerto, or Dead Well, the 1967 documentary that returns us to the oil camps, but in a very polemic kind of documentarian way. This was a film that was directed by Carlos Rebolledo, who is an advocate of tercer cine, or third cinema, kind of very leftist, didactic, polemic cinema from the 1960s. And it is essentially a kind of muckraking exercise in revealing the squalid conditions of the oil camps in the wake of abandonment by the oil companies. And so it provides the flip side to the dream of Amway and Judivana of chapter 2. But also, El Techo's aims are always more radical and more upsetting, and I say that with such love, than taken at face value, because as a straightforward documentary, it doesn't work. It is full of dissonances and dislocated voices and jump cuts and edits and repeated edits that start to scramble our sense of linearity and our sense of narrative cohesion. And so with El Techo, I argue that they attempt to hijack, and demolish the kind of petrocultural edifice in their efforts to, to transform society, to change life, as their slogan kind of put it. And by undoing the whole prospect of narrative logic, it starts to poke holes at the supposedly impermeable structures of petroculture, of oil, of development, of modernity. And it's a film that was very little seen in its own moment. El Techo ran into many, many issues with the government and with censors and with the powers that be. But now El Techo is finally getting, I think, their due. This is another work made by Daniel Gonzalez, the late Daniel Gonzalez, who was a member of El Techo, called El Llanto de la Chatarra, in which we see a scrap heap assuming very unnerving and very frightening kind of dimensions, as if it is crying out. So this is the kind of the waste and the overflows of refinement. And then, of course, there's Rolando, who features very prominently in the epilogue. And these are a series of serigraphs that are printed in gold, one of your early interventions and forays into a kind of petro-iconography, if I could say such a thing, in which we have a kind of almost Warholian impulse to kind of, produce a print, but of Maracaibo, of the oil derricks, and to print them in gold, again, kind of bringing us full circle to the idea of black gold. And I wanted to end with Rolando, not only because you're so formative, I think, to my own thinking about oil and about oil cultures in Venezuela and beyond, but also because I think we are finally, I think, in a moment now, in the 21st century especially, in a moment of climate emergency, of political emergencies. It feels like they're cascading all around us. But I think we're starting to become attuned to the mechanics of oil culture and to the ubiquity of dependence on fossil fuels and the Faustian bargain of what seemed to be such a triumphant shortcut to becoming modern, to becoming developed, to becoming however we wish to put it. That came at a very, very steep cost. And I don't want to kind of end on a downer, which is difficult to do when you're talking about petroculture, but I think that I am very interested in the kind of unlearning that is required and the new sensibilities that arise, and just being attuned when we start to see oil, everywhere, oil in the abstract, oil in barrels, oil in everything that we are looking at. And I love that Rolando, I think, gets the last word in the book and the final quote. And it was from an interview that we were doing, I think probably a decade ago. And you said that oil actually doesn't have a nationality. It belongs to everyone, or it belongs to no one, maybe. And I think that we have to be respectful, I think, of oil, of nature, of, the world that we have built, or unbuilt for ourselves. And I just want to say thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow. Now I have to talk. Well, after the brilliant speech of my friend Sean, well, in my all this age I become very shy, you know, I have to tell you. And October 27, I'm going to be 81 years old. Believe it or not. I can do an striptease, huh? And believe me, it will be all right. And my wife, I am 30 years older than my wife. And she's there. She's the most beautiful lady that I haven't seen my entire life. And I love it. I love her. I'm madly in love with her every day. So fantastic. Thank you very much, Sean, especially to invite me. It's very interesting because I met Sean many years ago in New York. I came to New York to fix my resident visa. Now I am an American citizen. Now I have an American passport. But it cost me a lot of years to get my American passport. And I came to New York, and I met this guy in an exhibition, and he came to me, and he said to me, "Are you Rolando Peña?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, maybe I am, you know." And what do you ask me for Rolando Peña? I said, "Because, you know, I want to interview you." And I said, "Oh my God, I love it." "Yes, of course." So we have an appointment in Washington Square Park, right, Joe? So, and I invited to a little coffee place in I don't remember the street. It was McDougal. No, it wasn't McDougal. And he got a little stuff to tape me, and we talked for 2 hours, something like that, right?
I think so,
Yeah. And I say to myself, "Oh, holy shit. This guy is a genius." Honestly. And I believe he's a genius. I always say that. He's a genius, honestly. He's so brilliant. And he's so clear. He's so clear about something about petroleum. I don't know nothing about crude oil, honestly. I don't know what the fuck is crude oil. I think crude oil is an invention, you know? It's like Hollywood, you know? I think Hollywood invented crude oil, you know? Crude oil is energy. He asked me, "Did you do crude oil because you are from Venezuela?" And I said, "Please, I detest nationalism. I hate nationalism to death. Because the most horrible thing in life and civilization is the people that believe in, I am from Venezuela, or I am from New York, or I am from Argentina. Fuck all of them, man. I am from wherever I am. I am right now in New York. I am from New York. Now I'm in Miami. I don't like Miami. I love Miami because my wife lives in Miami and I live with her. But I am from Miami also. I love Spain and I love everything, you know. And I told him I don't believe crude oil belongs to Venezuela. I mean, oil, I mean, for me, oil is energy, and I love energy. I'm always very interested in energy since the time that I was born. I'm sorry for my accent, you know. I haven't lost my accent, but I have to tell you something. I practice my accent every day. I don't want to lose my accent. I love it. I think to have accent is fantastic. It's very charming. It's very charming, right? So anyhow, El Techo de la Ballena is a very interesting group. They started in the 60s. It was poetry. It was Carlos Contramaestre, Copolicano Valles, Salvador Garmendia, Rodolfo Izaguirre, a great guy. It was a group of beautiful people. And the Techo de la Ballena, I had the great honor that it was founded in the garage. You know what is garage? In the garage of my house in El Conde. You see, I met Carlos Contramaestre, and he told me, "Listen, we have a group and we need a place to you know, to do happening, performing, whatever, you know, painting, you know, very nice stuff, you know." I said, "Yes, of course, I like it." I was very young at that time. I'm still very young, I believe it. I have the presumption that I am still very young. So I say to my mother, "Listen, mother, it's a group of very interesting people. You know, they're poets, artists, painters, photographers. That they want to rent the garage. We don't have a car. We never have a car. I don't know how to drive. I never in my life drove a car, never, and I'm very happy about it." So my mother looked to me and he said, "A group of people that paint and do poetry. Oh, shit. And I say, but the director is a doctor. Because Carlos Contramaestre, believe it or not, he's a doctor. You know, that's a contradiction. I mean, we're all full contradiction. For God's sake, how nice. Sounds a lot. Sounds good. You know? The contradiction is the base of everything, of art and everything. Because, you know, honestly, to tell you the truth, when people ask me, well, you're an artist, you've been doing art for 50, 60 years. What is art? And I say, oh, shit. Can you explain to me what is art? Because I don't know what it is to be an artist. I don't know what is art. I mean, what the fuck is art? It's a sensation, no? It's a fake, it's a big fake, you know, in a way. But this is the only thing that I've been doing all my life, and that I love it, and that I'm going to die doing that. Now let's go back to crude oil, because then it's going to be something else. When I was very young, I went with my older brother, Ramon. He took me to the lake of Maracaibo. I was around 6, 7 years old, and I started to see all those oil derricks and oil punks. And I have to tell you the truth, I got so impressed. I am still impressed. I have a photo in this book. I have the photo where I'm naked from here down, doing, you know, like those kind of stuff in front of an oil derrick. And you know, I still have that sensation. I think crude oil is really something, you know. It's something very horrible, but it's something fantastic, you know. It's magic. And I think the problem with crude oil is that people got too ambitious, you know, and too greedy. So, and they fuck it up. But it's not the problem of crude oil, the problem of the people. Crude oil is still down there, you know. I am sure right here is tons of crude oil, you know, right here. If we start to open, to drill down, it's going to grab shit of crude oil everywhere, you know. So I do really honestly believe the crude oil is something like a gift of God, and in the other hand, it's a gift of Satanas, of the devils, you know. It's a mixture. But I have to ask you something. It's not everything mixed like that. Life and civilization. What's happening right now is not horrible. You see? I'm not going to talk about politicians. I hate politics people. I don't like politics. I have nothing to do with politicians. I'm completely against that. I am a libertarian human being. That's what I believe I am. But I have to tell you something. I am very happy to be here. All of you, and especially Sean. I love Sean, you know. I think he's a fantastic guy, you know. He's a fantastic human being. He's like my friend Javier Telles, he's right there. I love Javier Telles also, and all of you, you know. And Nina, and Elohim, and Marcos. You see, it's so many people, and that's life, you know. Life is that. Life is so simple, my God, for God's sake. It's simplicity. And I hope one day, one moment, we'll reach that simplicity. And believe me, when we reach that point, simplicity, we're all going to be very happy, all going to go around and dance together and kiss each other. Really, and it will be fantastic. Thanks very much.
Sure, let's start the conversation then. Several things. The picturing of oil is something that a lot of people have contemplated, especially recently, or even the theorization of oil. I mean, Rolando just presented it very straightforwardly, but the argument that seems to be gaining some traction is that it's very difficult to image. It's very even difficult to conceptualize what oil is doing. There's a fabulous book called Slow Violence by Rob Nixon that argues that one thing, what takes place is so unspectacular that it's very difficult to image. Now you're talking about spectacular. Well, you were actually quoting some people, including Lisa Blackmore, whose work
Yes.
is fabulous, about the spectacular modernity that oil produces. How do we reconcile the spectacular on the one hand and the inability to image that somebody like Rob Nixon and many
Yeah.
others?
Absolutely. I would say the spectacular is almost like it's a facade, I think, that's doing a lot of work to obscure the very mundane mechanics at play. And I think part of the challenge of conceptualizing or coming to terms with petroculture, it's very similar, and I think not for surprising reasons, but it's directly related to the challenge of coming to terms with climate change. These are forces, and what Timothy Morton would say, like a hyper object, that are so beyond our capacity to grasp that we can only access them at certain kind of points. It's almost like it's as if we were I'm thinking of the cover of hyper objects. It's the iceberg. It's as if we can only see the tip of the iceberg or access it from different sort of points. And I think that the spectacle it comes into fruition, into view in many different ways. I think, thinking particularly of petroculture, there is kind of the spectacle of the Hotel Humboldt and this, really quite impressive and stunning. What is it? It's a 7-star hotel now. I think it's how it's currently being marketed in Venezuela. That's almost kind of too much to even take in or to handle. And that's the very utopian, I think, kind of aspect. But if we think of kind of just the images of oil spills, of fires, of refineries that are exploding, like the Amway refinery, which exploded just about I think over a decade ago, if I'm getting my dates right. And these are kind of moments where we can grasp an edge of the structure that are very spectacular. But it's also just a kind of glimpse of a much, much more mundane, slow-moving. I think Nixon is a great kind of point of reference. But moments where it's just a symptom of a much, much bigger and much more complex sort of assemblage, to put it in very Jane Bennett terms, of what's actually happening.
I mean, perhaps in a related way, and to both of you here, could one think, when one is talking about art, instead of visualizing petroculture, contemplate how petroculture has entered into the material of production of art, of oil paint, acrylic paint, film stock. We can keep going on and on. How petroculture is actually the material, is the matter of art.
Definitely.
And what would we do with that? I mean, is there something that you could? I mean, do you touch on that in your work, Rolando?
Oh yes, of course.
Can you explain it to us a little bit?
Yeah, and I did that. It's oil spill with really crude oil. I did at the Venice Biennale, represent Venezuela once, and I did a big oil spill in the exhibition. It was real oil, and I did a small multiple, small jars with crude oil, a documental in Kassel many years ago or so. And what can I tell you? Listen, oil is everywhere. I mean, really. And it's really it's terrible. The way the people use oil, especially big corporation. I mean, it's an speculation, and they transform oil in some kind of very dangerous ecological stuff.
You mean oil as a fossil fuel?
Yeah, but in the other hand, I mean, we use oil every day, the electricity, everything. So, well, I mean, it's a very heavy, big question. What shall we do? Really? You say, oh, fuck oil. So we don't have a car, we don't have a gasoline, we don't have benzene, we don't have nothing. What shall we do?
Yeah.
We're back to the what? I don't know.
And I think to add to
It's a
that,
question that I ask to everyone. I mean, what do you think about it? Are you agree with me or you disagree? if you disagree with me, I'm very happy because I disagree also. No problem.
But I think to add to that, we also wouldn't have a lot of modern art. To think about kind of oil paint or even,
Right.
thinking specifically plexiglass. It's a
Right.
wartime material. That's it derives from petrochemicals,
Right.
and that's how Soto, arrives
Yeah.
at
The
kinetic
Bauhaus.
art. The whole
All
Bauhaus,
the Bauhaus
Las
is based
Mahalinage.
in crude oil.
Exactly.
They don't know about it. But I arrived and I told them, listen, this is crude oil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, plastic is crude oil. You know.
But and I think thinking about the legacy of the Bauhaus or even Soto and kinetic art, in that kind of dimension, oil is seen as something that why would you not take advantage? Why would you not
Right.
refine it into these really impressive kind of materials that are they're lightweight, they're cheap, you can do a lot of things with them. They're never going to biodegrade, but that's a problem for a different time. And so I think it's difficult to kind of disentangle. And my students ask this all the time. It's kind of like, what do we do with all of this stuff? What do we do with the legacy of of the oil cultures that we've inherited? Because, and I have to confess to them, I don't have the answer. I don't think any one of us has the answer, because we haven't built an infrastructure to sustain not being dependent on oil. We're kind of trapped.
Okay, but the historian in me would say this is only a 140-year-old, 150-year-old at the most phenomenon.
Yeah.
So this is hasn't been forever in perpetuity. Oil as a fossil fuel, oil
Yeah.
supplement, it followed. I mean, the development of oil as an energy source, fossil fuel oil as an energy source, because whale oil was producing
Yeah.
illumination, but is a late 19th century phenomenon. So we're making it sound like it's everything there is, but there a lot of a lot of engineering happened without oil
Absolutely.
as a fossil
Yeah.
fuel.
But I think it's like, I'm sorry. I think like it's the internet. You cannot go back. Once it's there, how do you go back?
Right.
It
And-
has the same problem.
And I think oil production doesn't arrive Athena-like out of nowhere, because it follows the patterns of sugar production and sugar refinement, of mining for oil. There's a much longer. So even if it's not oil per se, and oil is absolutely a kind of modern phenomenon, but I think the ground has already been very well tilled at that point, where it is the latest substance that is
Right.
quote unquote discovered. It has very different kind of dimensions in terms of the refining process and our own relation to it and what it can do, and that I think is where it becomes singular. But I think it also plugs into a lot of pre-existing conceptions about what nature is for and our relationship to it.
Right.
So we'll go to the audience. Yes.
Rolando Peña, thank you for the technical. First part for Rolando, if you can continue, complete the story of the Techo de la Ballena and your garage,
Yeah.
because only heard a little bit. And Sean, can you expand a little bit on Techo de la Ballena, how it interacts with your book and the 60s events for the two versus Soto and the other things that you mentioned?
Yeah, definitely.
So they ended up using your garage?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. My mother rented to them.
That's where it started.
Yes, in El Conde. In Caracas was an urbanization, a beautiful urbanization, middle class, called El Conde. Maybe the Black Prince is because I was born in El Conde. I don't know. I never know what the fuck is the Black Prince, to tell you the truth. But art is like that. It's a big mystery.
Were you interacting with the members of the Techo de la Ballena?
Absolutely, I was very young, but I stole the first book of Rodolfo Izaguirre, called Alacranes. I stole it, and then I came to him and I said, Rodolfo, please, can you sign this book for me? And he looked to me, and he said, do you bought this book? And I said, no, I stole it. And I said, oh, good for you. He signed it, and in the signing he said it. This guy, he came to me, he stole my book, and he wanted that I signed the book, and he did it. Rodolfo Izaguirre was a genius. He's a genius. He's still alive. He's 90-something. He's still alive. And it's more brilliant than his son that is very famous in Spain, Boris. But he's really brilliant, Rodolfo Izaguirre. It was like my master, one of my masters. I I have so many masters, you know. If I start to mention my master, oh shit, we're going to be a, you know, a telephone book agent.
I love that story, and I have so much more respect for you now. But also, I think that also that sums up the whole spirit of El Techo. I think the fact that Rodolfo would see that and be like, you know what, good for you that you have stolen the book from me, because they were so counter to the status quo and wanting to essentially, just demolish everything that a quote unquote modern Venezuela stood for, and they were against kind of everything that Soto kind of was representing, which is very ironic because Soto actually participates and collaborates with El Techo in 1961 to do a kind of ephemeral mural. And of course, the members of El Techo say, well, we tricked him, to kind of like co-opt it and, co-opt his fame. What a fool. And Soto, I think, would disagree with that. But that's kind of the kind of punkish spirit of El Techo, where they had homenaje a la cursilería, to kitsch, to everything that was repressed by the modern. Contramaestre, most infamously was the kind of the I'm even trying to think, the artist or the doctor or the butcher
It
of
was a doctor, butcher, it was everything.
of
It was an artist, artists, we are like that,
Yeah.
We're intelligent, we're stupid, we're everything,
But
we're human.
yeah, and you use a lot of kind of oil barrels and kind of materials from the oil industry in your work, and Contramaestre preferred to use animal bones and viscera and guts in an exhibition titled Homenaje a la Necrophilia, or Homage to Necrophilia, which was forcibly closed by the health authorities. But they were trafficking, at least at the outset, in an early kind of informalista sort of mode that was, on the one hand, very much in vogue at the time and for a few years in the 1960s in Venezuela, but also very much counter to the supposed rationality and purity and transcendence of geometry. It was very kind of, blood and guts, literally in the case of Contramaestre. But El Techo was very much in a Dada surrealist sort of lineage, which was like completely different
They
direction.
were very influential in the Dadaism and the surrealism. Of course.
Doing publications, poems that kind of fracture even a poetic verse kind of format, exhibitions, protests, film. They're a really, really rich and fascinating group that is now coming. I think they're being revived and being recognized justly as the pioneers that they were.
Well, I'm very happy that now people start to recognize them. They were really great, fantastic people. They were pioneers, honestly, they were pioneers. And I think we, the people of my age, because I was very young at the time, I mean, they influenced me a lot. I mean, I always say, thanks to Adriano, to Salvador, to Rodolfo, to all of them, great people, beautiful people. They were artists, I think with artists we are fantastic people, I think we are the best people in the entire fucking civilization, honestly. You see, I don't like politicians, and military, I don't like military, I think they have to be there, of course. But I really, honestly, every day believe more that we are great, honestly. Without any modesty, I believe that I'm great. My wife is fantastic. You people here, you are fantastic, all of you. Beautiful people, fantastic people, great people, intelligent people, brilliant people. I mean, what else do we want in life and civilization? Fuck it, What else? We're all going to die very soon. I'm 91 years old. Maybe I will die in 1 year. I don't know, 5, 10, I don't know. But I'm still very happy. I'm still here, talking to you. And I'm so happy that you are here, I congratulate all of you, and I thank very much everybody, honestly. Let's continue.
So let's continue. So Sean, the question that came from the audience.
Yes, please. Can you people ask questions?
For those of us who, for those who haven't read your book,
Yeah.
what is the conceptual link between Soto's vibrating objects and Techo de la Varela?
Oh, absolutely. I think they're looking at two different approaches towards the kind of matter-energy continuum, in which for Soto, matter is a potential source of transcendence, of vibration, of a kind of refinement lowercase r, into a kind of higher state of being. Not literally in this case, but much more philosophically. And for El Techo, they're kind of working in the reverse, trying to think about the rematerialization of crude, of magma. They have, in their early writings, they frequently reference the concept of magma as this destructive, energetic, violent force that is amorphous, that is disgusting, that is, probably emerging from the earth, and it's a pretty clear metaphor for crude. In that respect, not just crude, but kind of everything that crude represents in terms of the formlessness, about the anarchic, and the potential for a kind of creative release of energy, which goes back to the kind of the Dada surrealist sort of strain of destruction as creation, which is also having not a revival, but a kind of fascination across South America. Thinking of the Arte Destructivo exhibition in Buenos Aires, just around the same time. But with El Techo, they're very interested in kind of the materiality of matter itself in a way that, so I think Soto is as well, especially during the, his so-called Baroque period of the 1960s, but they're interested less in kind of discovering a kind of transcendent or a much more kind of higher state of being that will unlock a kind of epiphany on the part of the viewer. The epiphany that El Techo is advocating for is that, to put it quite bluntly, the world has gone to shit, as they kind of saw it. And it's a moment of, particular political convulsion in Venezuela, which is immediately after the Cuban Revolution, immediately after the restitution of democracy with the election of Rolando Peña, but also the kind of neutralization and the banning of the Communist Party in Venezuela. And members of El Techo, to various degrees, were very much affiliated with the militant political left. A number of whom, had connections to FALN, the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional, which was a guerrilla group. Venezuela experienced the first sustained, guerrilla kind of infighting and warfare after Cuba. And so it's an extremely violent moment, and El Techo sees art and politics as intimately connected. And the status quo of Soto, of Cruz Diaz, of the kinetic and abstract monuments that are being not just shown in the exhibitions, but also adorning the facades of streets, of hotels, of public spaces in Caracas, that all of that is complicit in this kind of very rightward shift that they saw Betancourt as representing at this moment. And so El Techo is very much, I think, a very furious kind of collective that are trying, I think, to a certain extent, to think in very interdisciplinary terms about how do we confront the status quo. What is it going to take, whether it's a kind of outburst or it's in, an exhibition, homage to necrophilia, which incorporates, kind of very organic found objects, to put it very circuitously. And so they're thinking quite to kind of undo what they see as the lie of kinetic art.
Did anyone? You have? Oh, great,
I'm gonna pass
fantastic.
around the microphone as well,
Fantastic,
so we can
yeah. Please.
use reflections for posterity.
Yeah.
Here, actually, I'll get it to you. Thank you.
Thank you both for this amazing conversation, and congratulations, Sean, for your book.
Thank you.
I'm so glad that you also mentioned usar Pietri about Sembrar Petróleo, and I was wondering if you had like any reflection or you stumbled upon El Excremento del Diablo de Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso.
Yeah, and I think it's a kind of continuum. It's a Sembrar el Petróleo is this, jugo de la tierra, the juice of the earth that is going to, and I think it gets into what Rolando was saying about the dyad of, this is a substance from God that is, privileging the country, that, why would we not, if, and I'm speaking from the point of view of a kind of imaginary Venezuela, but if there is this repository of riches and money, it must be blessed, right? And then, of course, it turns into el excremento, which is the flip side of that, saying, oh, we, basically that's it. Like, we made a horrible mistake because now we are consuming, the devil's excrement. And Rolando actually has a piece called El Excremento del Diablo. Yeah.
He's by Pablo Pérez Alfonso that I met. I talked to him many times. Yeah. My brother was brilliant guy, very intelligent guy, was a DJ, very, very famous, very handsome, very fantastic guy, but very intelligent. He did a book with Perry Alfonso, and Ivan came to New York, he told me, listen, Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso really is very interested in what you do, and he said to me, your brother, he's completely insane or he's a genius. So I want to talk to him. So I went to Caracas, I went to his big house in Los Chorros, fantastic house. Perez Alfonso was a mystic. He's one of the founders of the Rampet. You know that, of course. And when we met, he looked to myself and I said, are you mystic? And I said, of course I am mystic. I don't eat meat. I don't smoke. I don't take drugs. My only drugs is ladies, women, that's it. Till in that time, now it's my wife. It's the only one. It's my wife, that's the only one, believe me. And I'm very honest. So, we started to talk, and he was great, He was a fantastic guy, really. He was a genius, Alfonso, absolutely. And I mentioned him many times in the sense that I mentioned Arturo Uslar Pietri, who was another brilliant guy, of course, yeah. I mean, they deal with the crude oil, but in different manner, in different way. Alfonso always say, yes, I am the founder of the faith, but crude oil is el excremento del diablo. How can you translate that in English?
The shit of the devil.
What? The shit of that?
The devil.
Very good question. Thank you.
I think I saw several other hands. Yeah, here.
So I know a few folks who are doing work thinking about like petromasculinity and specifically kind of gender analysis of these oil cultures, whether that's your guy who has to like drive the biggest gas guzzling truck to prove his masculinity, or all the kind of sexual imagery of like the very masculine kind of invading the earth and kind of dominating its resources. Is that part of your analysis? Are there ways that it sort of shows up in kind of unexpected or interesting ways in Venezuela in the time period you're looking at?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the imagery that you were kind of speaking about the kind of like the drilling and the kind of the penetration of the earth, it's very gendered, it's very sexualized. And there is an entire kind of genre of the oil novel that emerges right around the same time as Uslar Pietri is writing in the 1930s, which is, Ramon Diaz Sanchez publishes Mené. Mené is the indigenous term for petroleum in Venezuela. And there's a particular chapter that opens with an almost kind of pornographic sort of description of the drills kind of drilling into the earth, and it's kind of quite shocking to read. But I think it absolutely is a gendered kind of framework, which I think gets into, we could move into a sort of ecofeminist critique of extractivism, where the earth is gendered as female, and with all the metaphors of being ripe for the taking, of being fertile. Kind of, we could go on and on in very crude kind of terms. So absolutely, yeah, that's I think at play as well. A little bit. I think the closest is probably Elsa Gramco in the early 1960s, who is a contemporary of Soto, of El Techo, but not necessarily kind of moving, well, to various extents. She's a very kind of singular individual, and Gramco incorporates car batteries in particular, and sort of kind of materials in a very assemblage, informalist kind of mode that have been taken, especially in recent, I think, critiques, to be a kind of commentary on the detritus and the material culture of an oil nation.
It's funny what you say. Yes, it's funny. When I did the oil tower, it was 4.5 meter high. I did it with build the tower.
Oh, in like copper.
Copper.
Yeah.
at the museum. It was right here in Way Street, by the way. And it struck me because Andy Warhol, he came and he loved it. He said to me, it's a very sexual symbol, the tower. And I said, well, I never saw it was sexual, in the tower, but that's what he said. Now you have mentioned that. It's amazing, huh?
Yeah.
That was many years ago. Vaso comunicantes.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll call it a reception. Blanca, you actually mind coming up a little? Sorry.
Thank you, Nicole and Alex, and thank you, Rolando and Sean. My question is for Sean. Has oil continued to be like source and site and idiom for Venezuelan art during like the last 40, 50 years? Like what happens if you were to write the volume 2 of your book? What would happen? Who would be featured there?
Well,
Thank
Rolando first and foremost, I think.
Yeah.
I would say probably Alexander Alberro, as well, has done a lot of conceptual work thinking about the links between oil and a kind of global sort of militarist infrastructure. He has a number of pieces that comment on the Iraq War in particular, as well as the connection between Alexander Calder, not literally, but as a kind of avatar of mid-century modernism. Ana Alenzo, I think, is doing some really, really interesting work of kind of with a lot of found objects of plastic and oil cans and oil drums. And so I think it's very much on the mind, especially now, given the current situation in Venezuela in the recent decades, about taking stock and kind of thinking along slightly different lines, whether it's with Rolando kind of working with barrels and spills. I think that's the kind of dialectic that you've really seized onto, the kind of containment and the rationality that's promised by oil, and then what happens if that's released and just is ungovernable and polluting and deathly. Versus kind of, I think, other artists who are thinking in more political kind of terms, not to say that your art is not political, but thinking like in terms of the geopolitics of petroleum. The fact that, this country invaded Iraq for many different reasons. The fact that we had a U.S. Secretary of State who was the former CEO of Exxon. There are very, very concrete links, I think, particularly in this country, but I think it's a global phenomenon about the pervasiveness of petroleum, and I think artists, many contemporary artists, are starting to kind of are starting to make that the core of their work. So I think part 2 would be what happens when we start to see petroculture and how do we critique it from within.